So looking at certification and non-destructive testing, and I'm going to focus on certification as it relates to aviation, okay? There's a lot of people that do NDT, and though they may spend some time doing it for aviation, they may also do it for civil engineering purposes, or they may do it for manufacturing purposes, or that kind of thing. And so there are standards that have come out for aviation. There's standards for those other industries as well, but they all tend to go back to agreement to kind of some of the same general standards, like who writes these standards, where do they come from? So we'll look at that as well. So the big one, the main thing in aviation is that the FAA has issued an advisory circular, AC 6531B. Now, what's an advisory circular? Tell me, if I were to ask you what an advisory circular is, what would you call it? What would you define it as? So it's non-compulsory. Why not? What's it doing? Yeah. Okay. It's to exhibit information. So a lot of this is going to be contained in other regulations, and this is kind of advisory circulars are used as kind of a clarification or an explanation, or say you need to pull information from multiple different regulations together. Okay, so the advisory circular, though it's not a binding document in the form of like the FAA regs, it pulls together everything in the regs that has to deal with NDT. Sorry, forgot to throw that on earlier. JC, yeah. So it's recommendations, or it's how things will work for the individuals first off, and it talks about things like experience, training, what your qualifications are, examination, how do we determine if you're qualified or not, and then ultimately the certification that you get when you go through that process. It also has information on there for organizations. You know, an organization might be a Part 121, scheduled air carrier. It might be a Part 135 carrier. It might be an MRO. Like a Duncan Aviation has an NDT department. They gotta conform to this. Even down to smaller organizations, if you're like an owner operator, a general aviation aircraft, there are times you may have to have NDT done. A couple of years ago, we had, was it the Piper Arrows here? That sound right? We got rid of them. I think it was the Piper Arrow. We had 2 of them in the fleet, and they were used at they're a higher performance aircraft. They were used at some other schools as well. And Embry-Riddle had one crash a few years ago. And what they discovered, it crashed due to a failed wing spar. And so there was an NDT, there was an eddy current inspection that came out that had to be done fleet-wide, especially on ones that were used for training, like we used them, in a similar manner to Embry-Riddle. And so we don't, Western, here, our fleet service doesn't have an eddy current qualified individual because we don't do it that often. And so, but we do have to say, how are we as an organization going to bring in a qualified individual, and what kind of qualifications are they going to have in order to be able to sign off our aircraft? So for organizations, things like written programs, you have to have a written program in place, how this is going to be performed. What kind of training and qualification they're going to do, and where do those certifications come from? What certifications are we using for that? So NDT is something that's done, it's a company-based certification process. Is anyone in here forklift qualified where they work? Or here, I guess, Western forklift qualifies, right? So forklift qualified, this is in a similar category to that kind of thing, or man lift category. It is done by the organization where the individual is performing the activity, okay? So whoever you you work for, if you're performing NDT, whoever you work for, that is who creates the certification program. Those that are done extensively, if you're constantly doing this, are going to have in-house. You're going to have in-house individuals, people that work for you or for your company, who are going to be qualified and going to be certified by your company. So you have to have a training and certification program. How do you get people qualified and certified? What kind of experience or OJT are they going to receive while they're at your company in order to become qualified? Because you can't just go out and perform NDT. There's a certain amount of OJT and experience required. You have to document and keep records that people have met these requirements and are qualified. And then how are you going to go about getting people through the certification program? And it doesn't have to be every single method. It can be certain ones. When I worked at the airline, we had in-house qualification for visual inspection, because basically every mechanic was at least level 1 visual qualified. Okay? We had in-house for liquid penetrant inspection. We had in-house for ultrasound inspection, and we had in-house for eddy current inspection. But our magnetic particle inspection, we would send out our parts that needed mag particle. Okay. If we had X-ray, we would bring in outside vendors to come in and do the X-ray. So our program was a hybrid. Some things were in-house. All this was managed in-house for the individuals who were performing liquid penetrant, ultrasound, eddy current, visual inspection. And then it also had elements for outsourcing. So the things that were done less often were outsourced. So, but when we did that, we still had to say, how are we going to verify the training and certification of the individuals that are going to come in and do it? All right, an individual who works for, say, a company that does X-ray, if I'm going to invite them in as a contractor to my facility, I need to make sure that they're not just sending somebody they grabbed off the street. Now, they don't have to be an A&P. They don't necessarily have to have their airframe and power plant. But they have to be versed and an expert, or they have to be versed and qualified in performing, say, X-ray, or performing whatever method it is that I'm contracting out. So in that, there still should be a verification or experience of OJT. That's going to be kept by the contract company. Okay? And then documentation and record keeping is going to be done by both organizations. Okay? The company that's being sourced to, they're going to have to keep records that their individuals that they're bringing in are qualified, have the experience, have the training. As a company, I have to keep records that my aircraft have been inspected by these qualified, certified individuals and the companies that they're coming from. So how does this work? So certification programs are going to they're going to go back. You have to create a program. As a company, you're going to create a program. But the FAA and others aren't just going to let you go out and say, yep, we're going to create a program without anything to back it up. This is how we think NDT should be performed, and we're going to create ours from scratch. There's going to be an expectation that you go back to some kind of standards that are out there. And so there are going to be, there's one or more, and I'll show you some of them in a minute, organizations that create national and international standards by which my aviation NDT program can be created, by which my industrial NDT program can be created, by which a civil engineering NDT program can be created, by which a bridge inspection program can be created, by which a rail transport inspection, an oil, tank. So there's all kinds of different areas these can be used, but there are the foundation it all rests on is there are organizations that have created kind of the base standards. And then those organizations have created kind of subsets and said, here are the standards that really apply to aviation. Here are the standards that apply to rail. Here are the standards that apply to highway. Here are the standards that apply to nuclear power plants. Here are the standards, so you can create programs that kind of fit those standards that are accepted nationally and internationally. And so that's going to include things like, for qualifying your individuals, those individuals that are going to perform NDT, what kind of classroom time do they have to have? What kind of experience do they have to have? And then how do you verify with in some cases, written or even practical examinations. How do you verify that you're going to do that? And what'll often happen is maybe I want to have some qualified individuals at my organization, but I don't want to have ownership of the entire training process, right? I'd rather outsource that to somebody who does that all the time. I want to get someone trained. They're going to come in and perform the NDT process. They're going to perform inspections in-house, but once a year, once every 3 years, I send them to an outside organization to get trained, and I say, you know what? For my NDT program, this is who my training vendor is. This is how my people get qualified. They go to this outside organization rather than doing it all in-house. So again, at the airline where we had in-house NDT and we would bring in outside, for the things that we did in-house, visual inspection, all training and everything done with that was done in-house. Because we had so many people, everyone we hired had to go through that. Liquid penetrant inspection training, that was all done in-house. Okay? Eddy current and ultrasound training, we would send people to an outside organization to do that. Because we didn't have enough people doing that on a regular basis that it made sense for us to build an entire training program in-house for that kind of a thing. Okay, but we would have those people in-house to perform those methods. And then, like I said, X-ray, we didn't do that enough, and we didn't want to deal with the NRC regulations, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We didn't want to deal with the expensive equipment. We weren't using it enough to justify the $1 million worth of equipment you need. So we would outsource that entire thing. And then whoever we would bring in, they would deal with training their individuals, keeping them authorized and all that stuff. So it can become a hybrid program, but you have to document all this. You know, how you structure this, how you make sure you're in compliance. It all has to be documented, and it has to be kept in your, it's covered in like a Part 121 air carrier. It's going to be kept as it's part of your standard operating procedures, or it's part of your certificate program, the whole program that says I am a 121 carrier. This is how I do NDT. So outside agencies, ultimately the employer, whoever you're going to be performing NDT for, not necessarily who you're going to for training, but ultimately your employer has the responsibility for authorizing that performance and verifying that you as a practitioner of NDT are qualified to perform whatever it is you're doing. That outside agency may certify it, and your company may say, yep, this outside agency that does NDT training, that's how we are going to say our people are qualified. All right, we're going to say if they pass the test at Joe's NDT training center, then they also are going to be qualified to work at Western Michigan Airlines, right? So that's where that outside agency can do a lot of that. They can even issue a certificate. We're going to say, okay, if you have a certificate that says you passed magnetic particle inspection at Joe's NDT training center, then you're also qualified to perform magnetic particle inspection at Western Michigan Airlines, okay? So that's kind of how that works. Now, a company doesn't have to accept it. Say now you decide to go to Central Michigan Airlines. Central Michigan Airlines says, we don't like Western Michigan Airlines. We're not going to let them use whatever requirements they had. They have to go to Jim Bob's NDT training center. We're not going to let them use any of the experience they had. They can do that. That's up to them. That's up to Central Michigan Airlines, because they can, each organization that is going to qualify people for NDT, they're going to put that program together. But it's going to be written into their op spec, how operation specifications, how they operate, and that's ultimately going to get approved by the FAA. So some of these standards that are acceptable to the FAA, if you want to build an NDT training program, or an NDT program, which includes training, which includes performance of NDT, which includes methods, the FAA is going to say, you know what, you can't just go out and develop yours from scratch. There are organizations who know a lot more about this than you do, right? And so that's where the FAA is going to say, okay, there's the Aerospace Industries Association. They've developed this set of regulations, or not regulations, but standards. Excuse me, standard A1A, AIA, NAS 410, or the Air Transport Association, ATA. They've created ATA specification, Spec 105. That's another way of defining NDT, acceptable NDT programs. I've talked about the American Society of Non-Destructive Testing, ASNT. They have SNT TC-1A, that's their aerospace standards. Many people have heard of ISO, International Organization for Standards, or International Standards Organization, ISO. ISO 9712, that's their set of standards. These all basically say the same thing. They're very, very similar. They might say it in a slightly different manner, but when you really dig into it, they're all pretty similar. Mil spec, okay, the military, they tell you how NDT is going to be performed in the military. Mil standard 410E. And then Canada, we have a lot of reciprocal agreements with them, so Canadian national regulations, and just that whole regulation there, okay? So these are a selection of them. So you might say, when you go to the FAA, when you say, here's our op spec for my airline, my Part 121 airline, that includes an NDT program, how we're going to maintain our aircraft. We have built our NDT program, and we've based it on ASNT standard SNT TC1A, okay? And so you have that as backing. These are put together by groups where, I mean, this is their full-time reason to exist is to create standards. You know, they have engineers and level 3 NDT technicians, people that know this stuff inside and out, and they publish these different standards. So when we create our program, it's going to cover any form of NDT you're going to have. So radiography, we've talked about X-ray, gamma, and CT scanning. There's also neutron radiation. It's another form. MPI, ultrasound, liquid penetrant, eddy current, thermography, infrared, acoustic emission, microwave and millimeter wave. We haven't talked about that. That's another one that would be in there. Leak testing can fall under NDT. In some cases, you might have your leak testing program fall under the NDT side of things. Laser testing, which can include holography, shearography, and profilometry. We were just starting to do profilometry at the airline when I was there. We'd just gotten our first profilimeter, and I'll talk about that when we do that, but it's basically using lasers to take very, very fine measurements. And then any other method used by an organization. And so, that's all going to be written in there. An organization may or may not use all of these. It's likely, and oftentimes you're not going to use all of ththese. You're going to use the methods that are required for, if you're in aviation, for your aircraft. If you decide to go out and do this outside of aviation, you're going to use, you're going to have the methods in your NDT program that apply to the things that you're going to be doing. You don't necessarily have to write every single method into your program if you're never going to use if you're never going to use holography. There's no need to really put it in your program, but just with the understanding that if all of a sudden you decide to use holography, you'll have to add it to your program, okay? Or millimeter and microwave testing, probably won't see, that's not really a high common one in aviation. It's probably not going to be in there. So for each one of these methods as an individual, if we start looking at the certification side of it, what does it take for you to perform methods? So there's a separate certification for each method. You can be, I've talked about, you can be qualified in one. You can be qualified to perform visual inspection. You can be qualified to perform liquid penetrant inspection. Those are probably the two most common. You may not necessarily be then qualified to do everything else, right? It can be pick and choose. Certain individuals, maybe that. So again, when I was at the airline, pretty much every A&P out there, everyone working on the aircraft, had to get at least visual inspection level 1 qualified. Okay? Can you effectively inspect the aircraft? That's pretty important as an A&P. Okay? Another group, slightly smaller group, somewhat actually probably significantly smaller group, but still decent size, had liquid penetrant inspection. We did a lot of that, but it wasn't every day that we did it. I'd do it a couple times a month. And then an even smaller group was qualified to perform eddy current and ultrasound. That was typically just what were called inspectors or the individuals that could fill in as inspectors could perform RII at a given maintenance facility. Okay, so at any facility, you had anywhere from about 2 to maybe 8 or 10 people who are qualified to do ultrasound or eddy current. Right? So you don't have to do everyone, and not everyone had everything. Now, the individuals we had who could do eddy current and ultrasound, most of them also could do liquid penetrant. They were all visual. You know, typically you kind of get some of them, and work your way down. But there could be, we had individuals who were only ultrasound and couldn't do eddy current. We had individuals who were only eddy current, couldn't do ultrasound. There was one night I was at a hangar, and our inspector realized that his liquid penetrant qualification had lapsed. And so even though he was technically more qualified in terms of time doing inspection than me, and that was more his job, I had to go out and do it just because mine was current and this other individual's had expired. And so, you know, he got it renewed. He was like, oh, I got to go just take the test again and get the eye exam and everything. That's the big thing, was the eye exam was out of date. So it's on a method by method basis. Same thing with level. You can be a level 1 in eddy current, and you can be a level 2 or a level 3 in liquid penetrant. Okay, so you don't have to be at the same level with everything. But for any of these, you have to pass, because all of them in some form or another require visual interpretation or visual detection and interpretation of the results. You have to be able to pass a basic eye exam. So vision, which is acuity and color perception, to qualify for any method. And that is something that has to be renewed annually. So once a year, you would have to get it. So the first part, visual acuity test, determining the smallest letters you can read. Most of you have probably seen one of these charts before at your eye doctor, or just in general. Now, I'm not projecting a certain size. I don't know where you'd have to stand in the room to actually test yourself on here. But if you look in so it's the smallest letters you can read on a standardized chart that's known as a Snellen chart, or card. They make them in a card form too. Held 20 feet, 6 meters away. So whenever you see one of these cards, usually there's a mark in the floor you got to head down, right? Anyone not done one of these tests before? Imagine everyone's seen one at least. What else do they give you as part of taking the test? You get the spoon looking thing, right? And that's because it is near vision in at least one eye. In fact, you can be blind in one eye and still get qualified for NDT. Okay, as long as you can see in one eye. Right? So at least one eye has to have corrected or uncorrected, so you can take this with or without glasses on, or contacts, or whatever you would use. I would recommend, does anyone wear contacts? Okay, if you're good, well, you guys both have glasses on. Anyone with contact, I would recommend not wearing contacts when you work on airplanes, especially if they have SkyDraw or other stuff. SkyDraw will fuse your contact to your eye if it gets in there. So get some safety glasses that are prescription, much better. So corrected or uncorrected, you got to be able to do 20/25, so this chart is blown up quite a bit bigger than what it actually is. You know, think of the standard size for it's about like yay big, right? You got to be able to read this line right here from 20 feet away with one eye closed or one eye covered with a standard size chart. Okay? And this has to be checked annually. Okay? Because again, as we get older, you know, most people's eyesight tends to get worse. So what they consider normal vision, 20/20, is you can read this at 20 feet away. Okay? So what it's saying is if you're here, if you're at 20/25, it would be a normal person standing 25 feet away. You know, your vision, if you have 20/25 vision, it'd be the same as someone with 20/20 vision standing 25 feet away. Okay? If you have trouble reading this, it's the same at the top, the E, line 1. If you have trouble reading that, it means someone with what's considered normal vision would be standing 200 feet away. Okay, that's kind of how that system works. So that has to be checked annually. That's the acuity part. The other part is a color perception test, okay? And it measures your ability to tell the difference among colors. Anyone in here know if you're colorblind? I can't be the only one in the room. I thought it was more common than that. A male-dominated industry. I know we've had other students that are. So you have to distinguish and differentiate between colors necessary for the inspection method for which qualification is sought. So a lot of these methods probably don't have much color that you have to see. If you're doing eddy current testing, there's really not a lot of color. You got to distinguish between black and white on a display, right? Even the older ultrasounds were all black and white. The ones that it becomes critical is the dye penetrance, right? You got to be able to see the fluorescent dyes really well. This only has to be completed once. Typically throughout your lifetime, you're either colorblind or you're not colorblind. You really don't have a lot of change in this side of things, so they don't retest. I guess it can happen, but it's so uncommon that there's no need to do this once. So you got to have this test done annually. This you have to have done once. And there's two types that you'll see. The first one's is an Ishihara test. The second one's known as the yarn test. Here's an Ishihara test. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. I'm going to go ahead and pause it for a minute. So for somebody that can't pass this, they'll give you this or something similar. The version I had was a piece of cardstock with a bunch of yarns on it, just pieces of colored yarn tied on. So then we go down that. Blue, red, pink, green, white, yellow, right? Aqua, yellow, yeah. Blue, light blue, yellow, white, yeah. So, that's basically, if you know kind of your primary, secondary colors, and you can see that's about all you have to be able to see. But you'll get both of these. They have both of these types of tests that you can do. So I fail this one miserably, but I could pass the yarn test well enough that I could perform like fluorescent liquid penetrant inspection. There really wasn't too much that I wouldn't be able to do. Am I the colorblind? We went through it. I'm red-green colorblind primarily. So that gets us then into certification. We passed that. Then we need to be certified. What are our certification? So what is an individual allowed to do? Level 1 is the first level you get. Okay. They go level 1, 2, and 3, getting more and more knowledge. So level 1, preparing parts, conducting tests, recording data, making a decision on clear indications, okay, that don't require any interpretation. So what you're expected to do, perform the part preparation and the after inspection process, cleaning. Follow the procedures pertinent to the specific technique. So for a given part, object, section, you're going to be given the procedure if you're a level 1. You're not developing it. You'll typically receive guidance from a level 2 or level 3. In the organization, airlines I was at, our quality control inspectors were level 2 liquid penetrants, so they could oversee the training and visual inspection. They could oversee the training of the level 1 AMP, airframe and power plant mechanics, or technicians who would perform the visual inspection and the dye penetrant inspections. And then they were level 2 and pretty much anything, so they could oversee some of this stuff. And then meet the training and experience guidelines in Table 1, which we'll look at in just a second. We'll summarize these in a second. For someone to be level 2 is able to set up and standardize equipment. Okay, more than just putting in the, it's not just putting in the values, but it's setting up doing the calibration process of the equipment, that kind of thing. Conducting tests, interpreting, here's the big thing, interpreting and evaluating the results. Okay, so if there's an indication that isn't clear and present, but rather it requires some interpretation, you have to go to somebody that's a level 2 to perform that extra kind of determination. And then documentation of results. So all the responsibilities of level 1, setting up, standardizing equipment, conducting tests, interpreting, evaluating, organizing document results. You need to be familiar. So some of the things you add, familiarity with the scopes and limitations of the methods you're qualified in, where they can be used, what they can be done, and capable of providing that OJT for the level 1 inspectors. A big thing here is you're starting to get familiar with those code standards and other regulatory guidelines that are used to set up the program and run the program. And then just like level 1, there are training and experience guidelines listed in table 1 of AC 6531. For level 3, here is where you select the methods and techniques. What that means is here is a part. We don't know anything about it. Well, we know about it. It was just, here's a newly created part, a newly created portion of the aircraft. What's the best way to perform inspection on it so we can find, any expected failures before they become critical or before they become to the size that they cause something to fail catastrophically. So they also are going to select and design the reference standards for those items where, like eddy current, ultrasound, where we have to have a reference standard to go off of. You need to design that so that it accurately portrays whatever it is you're going to be testing. They write those procedures. What do you set the frequency to? What do you set the gain level to? What do you set the driver to? What do you set, what's the concentration of particles that you should be using? How long should you let the penetrant dwell? How long should you let it develop? How hot should your dryer be? Okay, those kind of things. That's where level 3 starts to come in. And then they're also doing interpretation of those They're saying this is what the code says, this is what the standard says, this is how we meet that, this is how this test meets that, this is how this training program meets that. So they are responsibilities same as level 1 and 2. They're going to select those methods and techniques. They're designing the tests. They're designing the processes that are going to be used. Verifying the adequacy of procedures. When we are figuring that out, we want to make sure we're actually going to find the flaws that we need to find. They can provide OJT and examination of level 1 and level 2 inspectors. Again, that interpretation of codes is the big part. Okay? They're kind of like the Supreme Court for the NDT world, right? Supreme Court interprets the laws that are written by Congress. Level 3 inspectors interpret the regulations and the standards that are put out by these other agencies. Those are developed by level 3, and then they're, it's kind of peer reviewed. And they have to have a minimum of 4 years combined school and work experience, so much more critical. So the level 3 qualifications aren't set out in like a standard table. They're a little bit more fluid. So here's that table 1 that I was referring to and what it means for the different standards. So, for example, eddy current, to be level 1 qualified, you have to have 40 hours of classroom instruction, plus you have to have 480 hours or 3 months of experience. Okay? It doesn't mean you're doing it every day for 8 hours every day. It just means that you are using it and using it in areas to inspect in order to do that. You can see mag particle is lower. We've done most of these. We haven't done radiography, but you've done eddy current, ultrasound, mag particle, penetrant. Some of you are working on thermography right now. You can see that the mag particle is pretty easy, right? Mag particle only takes 16 hours of classroom time and 160 hours or 1 month of performing it to get your level 1. Eddy current, ultrasound were a lot harder, right? There's a lot more. It's less. It's kind of more opaque. What's going on? It's not. I look at it, I see it. It's more what's going on in the part. How is that sound traveling through the object? How are the eddy currents forming, and what is the probe picking up? Right. So that requires more training. Level 2. These are in addition. So like if we're looking at eddy current, level 1's 40 hours of instructions. You need an additional 40 hours of instruction once you're a level 1 to become a level 2 in eddy current, for instance. And then you need another 9 months of on-the-job performance, or 1,440 hours. Okay, so you can see it's a bigger jump to go from level 1 to level 2. Okay, especially it really isn't, it's the same amount of classroom time. It's an additional, basically, week of classroom time. But it takes 3 times the amount of experience in order to get qualified as a level 2. Okay, same thing with ultrasound. Mag particle, they work the same way. It's just the easier mag particle penetrant. They're a little bit easier, quicker to learn. Okay. Infrared thermography is interesting. It's in the middle. It requires the 40 hours, but it doesn't require quite as much experience as eddy current or ultrasound. So once you get it in your hands, it's something that you tend to pick up quicker, a little bit easier. For level 3, there's some different ways you can do it. So a lot of level 3s, if people that are level 3, have either an engineering degree, so they understand the physics and mechanics of what's going on, or they come from a program like what we have here that you're in, where you're getting a lot of a more stringent, like practical approach to learning this stuff and applying it. You're seeing how it applies in the industry. And so, but you would still need another year of experience as a level 2 inspector. So you have to get that level 1 first, and then, you know, that takes at least 3 months before you can get your level 1. Then you need another 9 months there before you can get your level 2, and then you need another year after that before you could become a level 3. If you didn't have a 4-year degree, you could do a 2-year, you know, someone that's got a 2-year program, they would need an additional 2 years of experience. Or someone that, you know, people do go into NDT without any kind of a degree, where they, you know, they primarily do it as like a apprenticeship type situation, but that takes 4 years as a level 2. So they have to get that level 1, and then they have to get that level 2. Then they need to be performing stuff for 4 years to really get it. Once you have a qualification, then you need to maintain it. And so for level 1, level 2, you have to recertify every 3 years. And recertification involves a certain amount of like classroom time, as well as documentation that you've been performing those methods during that time. You know, during the previous 3 years, actually during the previous 3 months. Sorry, 6 months. Level 3, once you're a level 3, you only have to recertify every 5 years. But there is a significant amount of continued training and continued performance, you know, showing that you're continuing to perform those methods, that you have to be doing during those 4 years in order to be able to recertify once that, during those 5 years, to recertify when that 5 years rolls around. It can be revoked, so if you, if you screw up, demonstrates unsatisfactory performance. Okay, that's in there, that's kind of the catch-all. If a company says, yeah, you're not cutting it, they can revoke it. And again, it's your company, it's the company or organization you're working for. If you go inactive in a given method for 6 months, so if you stop performing NDT, if you stop doing it regularly for 6 months, it's okay, you're probably going to be out of practice. You're going to need to requalify to get that way. Or if you can't meet that vision examination, you know, if you can't meet that vision acuity test on an annual basis. So even though these are good for 3 years and 5 years, you still have to have your vision checked on an annual basis. And just remember, it's a qualification, not a license, but a certificate. So some people ask, can you change employers? And that comes down essentially to the employer. Okay, personnel presently qualified to perform may request documentation. So if you are qualified to perform NDT, and say you're getting ready to change jobs, you want to go somewhere else, you can ask your current employer, the current organization, you say, I want my NDT record. They don't have to give it to you. If you're smart, you've kept it yourself somewhere, or you have the ability to download it, or, you know, most of the time that's kept online now, and you have the ability to save it if you want. And so that provides evidence of level 1, level 2, or level 3 qualification. You would then take that to wherever it is you're going, and you provide and say, hey, I performed NDT at, you know, Western Michigan Airline. Now I'm coming to Central Michigan Airline, and I want to do it. And they'll either say, yeah, this looks good, or we want to put you through a bit of training, but we can kind of fast track you. Or they can say, you know what, we're Central, we don't like Western, we're not going to take anything that you got while you were there. It's purely up to them and how their program's written. Okay. So I worked for 2 airlines. The first one I had, I was qualified. I took the stuff with me the second. It allowed me to fast track becoming NDT qualified at the second airline I was at. When I left that airline, I basically printed and saved all my OJT on-the-job training records, all my formal training records, so that when I've moved on, I could have those with me to be able to take. So just in the, when I came here, well, what do you want to teach? I could teach NDT. Here's what I've done in NDT. Here's the proof that I've done it. Wester says, great, we'll let you teach it. Not only that, no one else wants to teach it. So here you are, you got me for NDT. So it's up to the employer whether they're going to certify you or not. And that is all I got for certification.